For more on an eventful 24 hours in the Capitol, they all seem eventful now. We turn to Philip Bump, national correspondent for The Washington Post. Philip, good morning.
Morning, sir.
Let's talk about the most recent news, which literally happened while most of us slept.
Correct.
Maybe you weren't sleeping. But this is a major legislative win for the president, right, and something he's looking for, but it's not law yet. Where does it go from here?
That's exactly right. So the House has passed a version of the tax cuts already that passed basically without notice because the House has a much stronger Republican majority. The Senate bill now has a different set of changes to tax law. And so essentially they now go into something called conference, where the House and the Senate try and work together and figure out one unified package that everyone can agree to that then has to go back to both chambers for another vote. So this is not over yet, but this is a much further along process than was the health care bill, for example, which we all know failed in the Senate earlier this year. So this is significant for the Republicans in that sense.
It's significant also insofar as it bucks a decade of Republican orthodoxy about not adding to the federal deficit, right? Philip, by the most rosy estimates, this is going to cost at least $1 trillion. That's
exactly right. So there's a group called the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is actually a congressional nonpartisan group, which assessed this bill. And even incorporating economic estimates for how the economy will grow, you're right. This would be a $1 trillion hit on the deficit. This is something, however, that Republicans have largely dismissed. Mitch McConnell yesterday saying, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying that essentially this would pay for itself. There would be enough growth. There are very few economists who actually think that'll happen. So this is a stark change.
The Democrats complained loudly about that they didn't have time to read the amendments in this bill, and that some of them arrived handwritten with words you couldn't even understand. We saw John Tester there. But does this set a precedent in terms of how bills, are drafted and passed?
We'll see if it sets a precedent. I mean, it's sort of hard to predict, but this is certainly something that the Republicans have learned is a way to, among other things, avoid a lot of public outcry, right? I mean, we saw that the health care bill, for example, was drafted very quickly. They tried to move it very quickly, and in part that was to avoid the sort of organized activity by grassroots Americans coming out and saying that they object to it. Now that this has to go back to conference, has to go back to the House and the Senate, there is more time for people to learn what's in this, to actually raise any objections or support if they choose to do so. But it was clear that part of that speed was meant to try and offset objections.
We talk about this as a tax bill, but it's also a health bill, Philip. It is going to repeal Obamacare's individual mandate, which is crucial to the survival of the marketplaces. What are the implications for the broad sectors of the American economy that are touched by this?
I mean, there are huge implications. It's a totally important point. And to some extent, we don't even know what all the implications are, in part because the bill was sort of cobbled together yesterday and has a lot of potential loopholes and a lot of potential implications. But the healthcare point is a totally important one. This is almost certainly going to lead to more people who are dropping out of healthcare and coverage, which will mean more people who end up declaring bankruptcy because they don't have health care coverage. The Congressional Budget Office actually looked at this, and because of the repeal of the individual mandate, there is essentially the federal government will be making money off of people who make less than something like $40,000 a year, even despite the tax cuts, because they'll be saving money on not having to help subsidize their health insurance. So this is, in that regard, then, this is even more beneficial to the wealthy and less beneficial to poor Americans because of that change to the individual mandate.
At the same time, Philip, that the president had what's arguably his biggest legislative victory. Right. All of this is being overshadowed by, of course, the Flynn situation. Right. What do we think the White House is feeling right now? Because their initial reaction was this is not a big deal.
Right. Well, I mean, if you look at what Donald Trump has said, at every point along the way, he said this is not a big deal, even after the meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and a Russian lawyer emerged last year. So that's sort of the White House's standard line. But this is a big deal, right? I mean, that Michael Flynn was charged with only one small thing suggests that he is working with Robert Mueller's team. He is prepared to give testimony. And Robert Mueller's not going to make a deal with him to give up some low-ranking member of the Trump staff. There's clearly some bigger fish that they're looking at here. And we know that there are sealed indictments as well that may include other people who may be working with Robert Mueller's team. There's a lot of nebulousness. We don't know all the answers here yet, but it's clear that Mueller has his eyes on something big.
Right. The significance of Flynn's information may be equally diametrically opposed to the sort of small size of the charges.
Exactly. Right.
Philip Bump from The Washington Post. Thanks, Philip.